Hello, I'm Rochelle Carey, in for Femioki, and you're in the stream. Today we ask, what are the dangers of deep sea mining? You look at the risks and rewards of mining the seabed for renewable energy. If you're watching on YouTube, please do join in the conversation. Leave your comments and questions on our live chat. We will be reading them and we will include them in the discussion. Deep in the ocean lie what some say are crucial resources for expanding the world's renewable energy. The discovery of mineral riches along the seabed has sparked mining mania, but also concern about environmental impact. Pacific nations are deep sea mining's main frontier and stand to benefit greatly, while also, though, being the first to feel any negative repercussions. Here's what some of those in those communities have to say.
The Pacific Ocean has long been viewed as a great empty space, out of sight and out of mind. For Pacific people, the ocean is our identity and the source of well-being. We are the ocean. In its preservation, we are preserved. And as guardians, we are drawing the Pacific blue line to protect our ocean in calling for a global ban against deep sea mining.
The biggest challenge is that our pro-mining government has not represented the full extent of environmental risk for deep sea mining during public consultations. We have just returned from a voyage on our traditional voyaging canoe, Marumaruatua, across our northern group islands, where we received considerable support for a pause of at least 10 years to collect more independent environmental data, as well as to build our local capacity to help inform decisions.
So is a moratorium needed to protect the ocean? Joining us to discuss this from Fiji, Maureen Pinjueli, an ocean activist and coordinator with Pacific Network on Globalization. That's a regional organization promoting economic justice and globalization across the Pacific. In Newark, Delaware, Salim Ali, a professor of energy and the environment at the University of Delaware. He's also a former advisor on environmental and social impact assessment to the deep sea mining company known as Deep Green. And in Boston, Massachusetts, science journalist Daniel Ackerman. Welcome to everyone. Daniel, I'm going to start with you with the most basic question. Explain to us what deep sea mining is.
Yeah, so deep sea mining is basically the extraction of mineral resources from the bottom of the ocean. And there are a number of different ways that it could work, but one of the most common proposals is to collect these resources called polymetallic nodules. So these nodules form over millions of years at the bottom of the ocean, and they're really rich in cobalt, nickel, copper, and manganese, a lot of these metals that we could potentially use for electric car batteries or wind turbines, things that will fuel the green economy. And so one of the more common proposals for getting these nodules, which can be miles below the surface on the seafloor, is basically to do a kind of vacuum cleaner system of the seafloor. And it would start with these maybe dump truck sized collector vehicles that would roam around on the seafloor, collect the nodules and all the associated sediment and seawater down there, and send all that material up a huge pipe to the surface where a ship might be, as you can see here, a ship might be waiting at the surface. On the ship, the nodules themselves, those valuable resources would be extracted, and then all the remaining sediment and seawater would be flushed back into the ocean at a depth yet to be determined. So that's kind of the basics of how this could work.
Okay, so that part about it being flushed back into the ocean, is that where the main concern is? What does this mean to flush all this back into the ocean?
Yeah, that is one of a number of points of environmental concern that a lot of marine biologists or conservationists are saying, like, hey, we need to take a pause and really study this more deeply, because when you flush sediment into the deep ocean environment, that could potentially really disrupt the organisms that live there, because the deep ocean is usually very clear. There's not much sediment or sand floating around in the water there. So the effects of flushing that sediment are not totally well known at this point, but it could, for example, disrupt the visual system of animals that rely on bioluminescence to communicate, or it could impact the filter feeding mechanisms of animals that basically get their food by filtering seawater. So there are a number of potential concerns with that sediment plume.
Okay, one more question before I bring in the other guest. So explain what the plumes are. You hear this term plumes a lot as you do research on this. Explain what that is.
Yeah, so there are two plumes that would be generated by a deep sea mining operation. So the first is way down on the seafloor, and it's called that collector plume. And it basically is all the sediment that will get kicked up into the water from the vehicle that is actually down there doing the collection of the nodules. So it's kind of this dust cloud near the bottom of the ocean. And then the discharge plume, which is all of that sediment and seawater that is returned after the ship has removed the nodules at the surface. That discharge plume, it's not a great analogy, but you might think of it as kind of a plume of smoke, but basically it's this extra sediment that will go back into the ocean and could potentially travel for kilometers away from the discharge site. But the exact behavior of that plume and its impacts is still a pretty intense topic of study for scientists right now.
It's going to be an intense topic on this show as well. Salim, so I want to talk more about the things that Daniel says could be extracted from the seabed. Tell us more about what those are and what the idea is to use them for.
Yes, so essentially the polymetallic nodules are unusual in that they have three metals particularly which are well suited for the next generation of car batteries that's being used already in many electric cars, but is likely to be also used in future electric cars, though there are alternatives being developed. And those three metals are nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So it's unusual to find all three of these metals in one ore body. So that's what is key to the nodules.
Okay. Maureen, when you look at the video, it seems almost obvious that this is disturbing an environment that we don't know a lot about. What do you think when you visualize what this is?
I think we have real experiences here in the Pacific Ocean, and particularly countries like Papua New Guinea were one of the first forefront countries to issue commercial license for deep sea mining to Nautilus Inc. This is way back in the early 2010 to begin commercial mining. It's never been done anywhere, so we have real experience in terms of impacts. Communities in PNG have reported that these tenements are just 30 kilometers away from villages and communities in the Bismarck Sea. They've reported what Daniel describes, which is sedimentation. They call it cloudiness of the ocean, affecting their livelihoods, ability to go catch fish, and certainly cultural practices. In the case of Tonga, fishermen have reported that they've had to go further and further out. So I think there are two components in terms of understanding impact. Here in the Pacific, we know in the very early phases of exploration what those impacts look like. And so when you look at those kinds of videos that you just played, they just really, those are kind of just prototypes of what these real machines would look like. The machines could weigh up to 300 tons. It's almost like land-based opens where you scrape the surface. So I think the appreciation of what impacts will look like today is certainly quite different. And for Pacific communities, we have real experiences with exploration in our region at this time. So I think we understand quite intimately.
Sorry to interject, Maureen, but to clarify for the audience, the Nautilus project was in PNG territorial waters, and it was not nodules. It was actually hydrothermal vents, very different kind of ore. So the impacts were different. And what is being proposed currently is in international waters. It would be under the International Seabed Authority's regulations, which was not the case with the PNG venture. So just to be fair, we want to make sure the audience knows that Nautilus is not the same, even though the same person as linked to both projects. The extraction is qualitatively different.
Maureen, you can certainly respond.
Well, I think I did qualify that we have real experiences in terms of proposals for deep sea mining within our EEZs. But I think Daniel's point around understanding impact now, and I think you could speak to the recent MIT research that came out around sediment plumes. We know that in terms of impact, the sediments can stay in the water columns for up to 400 days. It could travel distances of about 1,400 kilometers, which would touch the edge of a country like Kiribati, which is one of the closest in terms of EEZs to the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which you're talking about, where the ISA is regulating that. So I agree, and I did qualify the two differences. But my point being is that we have experiences, real experiences, in terms of what deep sea mining can do.
Daniel, let me ask you something. Salim referenced the ISA, the International Seabed Authority. Obviously, we're going to talk more about what types of research needs to be done and the pros and cons. But this ISA, what type of body is this? I mean, is this who would do oversight if there were to be more deep sea mining?
It is, yeah. So the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, is an organization that was chartered by the United Nations specifically to both preserve and regulate industry that happens on the seabed of international waters. So one thing that the ISA has been doing in recent years is trying to develop basically a rule book, an exploitation code of exactly how countries could go about extracting mineral resources from the seabed in international waters. That discussion has been ongoing for a number of years, but there's actually been a renewed sense of urgency to that work because earlier this year, Nauru, the island nation, announced that it would like to go ahead and move forward with a plan to do deep sea mining with a subsidiary of a company called the Metals Company. And that announcement by Nauru basically gave the International Seabed Authority 2 years in order to finalize that exploitation code, basically to finalize the rule book of how to regulate and oversee deep sea mining. So this is something that is moving forward in the next couple of years.
Salim, is 2 years long enough to do the type of research that's necessary?
Well, keep in mind that the International Seabed Authority has been around for more than 20 years. So there has been activity across almost 2 decades in terms of scientific research. And I'm also very concerned. I mean, I'm an environmental planner by training, and I am very concerned about impacts as well. But I'm concerned at systems level impacts. So we have a major problem with reference to climate change. We just saw the IPCC report issued yesterday, which has very grave forecasts of what's going to happen. So we have very tough choices to make. We have suboptimal solutions. Do we want to manage through adaptation, or do we want to find ways of mitigation through technologies like electric cars and so on? And when we do not have options like, for example, recycling, which is often presented, we all want recycling, but we all need metal stocks to recycle, and we just do not have the metal stocks. So that's why the 2-year timeline needs to be taken in context, because IPCC is telling us that we have so little time to deal with climate change. We have all these other pressures. And so that's why I became interested.
Okay, so I think that one of our viewers on YouTube is really summed up where we are in this conversation. It says, is it ethical to do this, to sacrifice the bottom of the ocean for achieving a greener world? So that's basically what we're talking about. We're describing doing something that is bad potentially for the ocean to make life greener above the ocean. Isn't that basically what we're discussing, Maureen, weighing the pros and cons of that?
Absolutely. And I think the point about climate change is quite critical. There's very little appreciation in terms of the ocean as a climate regulator, its role in terms of sequestering carbon and keeping carbon within the ocean system. There is still outstanding research to be done to understand how deep sea mining will impact the climate regulatory functions of the ocean itself, whether it'll release carbon into the atmosphere as a result of carbon that sits on the bottom of the seafloor. But there's also significant scientific research coming out that states quite clearly that on the seafloor itself are these methane seeps. Now, methane as a greenhouse gas is 3 to 4 times much more potent than carbon dioxide itself. So I think it's quite, and if you hit one of these methane seeps on the seafloor, scientists are calling this a climatic catastrophe if we do that. So I think on the science, and I think that your central point is that we're not looking at the ocean as that system which is already regulating the climate and appreciate that. Rather, we are paying only attention to the minerals for renewable energy sources. And I think that's highly problematic, particularly for the Pacific Island countries in which we're the forefront of climate change impacts. So we really understand that for batteries, this is about those in the wealthier countries. Greenwashing of these minerals are problematic.
So, Maureen, you talked about it. You brought it kind of, people keep saying this is for batteries, for renewable energy. But, I mean, the big car companies right now seem to not want to be involved, specifically BMW, Volvo, and Google, which is not a car company, but the bigger companies say that they are not going to be using ocean-mined metals until we know more about actually what it is that they do. Daniel, how would you characterize... Salim, go ahead.
Sorry, just a quick interjection.
Sure.
That has been used as an easy campaign slogan. Those companies, if you read the fine print, they are really making no tangible commitment. It was an easy way for them to just make the NGOs happy and score PR points. But the reality is that if they are in need, like even Tesla, Tesla has said, for example, that one of their cars, they're going to use lithium iron phosphate, which doesn't need cobalt. Well, if you read the fine print, they are still trying to source cobalt from Glencore, a major cobalt mining company. And it's only one model in China where they're using these. So you have to be very careful. Unfortunately, the devil is in the detail when you're going through this.
So, Daniel, let me ask you something. Is this both sides there's equal support for and equal against, or how would you balance this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly, how big the support versus opposition is on this, because it is a pretty new and developing issue to a lot of civil society groups. But I think one thing that's important to consider here is, when I talk to proponents of deep sea mining, whether in the scientific community or in the industrial community, one of the big pros for deep sea mining would be, we can offset some of the environmental damages of land-based mining. So, mining things like copper or cobalt from a mine on land can cause degradation of drinking water quality. It can cause deforestation. There are a number of labor issues, including child labor in some cases. But I think it's important to point out that if the world as a society does move ahead with deep sea mining, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to shut down all of the land-based mines. So there's really an open question here about whether deep sea mining is going to substitute for the environmental damages that we see on land from land-based mining, or whether deep sea mining will be in addition to those land-based mining operations.
We do have a lot of people watching. Salim, just a moment.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I want to bring in some of our viewers on YouTube, specifically Christian Rosh's comment describes this, in Christian's opinion, is just destroying the sea floor. And we do have some other thoughts from people that are describing some of the risks of this that we need to continue to discuss. So let's listen to that.
Deep sea mining will have long-lasting impact at the mining sites. The question is how these local effects of deep sea mining might potentially cascade through the larger ocean ecosystem, for example, to commercial fish stocks. The question we as a society needs to answer is, can deep sea mining indeed help us solve the climate crisis? And are the environmental risks of deep sea mining worth the environmental benefits of solving the climate crisis?
500 ocean scientists from across the world came together to underline and emphasize some of those very risks. They noted that ocean mining could accelerate species extinction, that ocean mining could create large toxic plumes, which are a hazard to seafood and could undercut the productivity of fisheries, and that ocean mining might impair the capacity of our oceans to store carbon and help us in the fight against climate change.
All right, so a really crass question that I'm just going to ask. Does the future of deep sea mining really come down to who can make money off of it and how much? I know this is being framed as something about making the environment cleaner, and we hope that that is the motivation. But sometimes does it just come down to that, Maureen?
Well, I think the key point here is that it is very clear scientifically that the impact will be irreversible. And in some cases, there will be no ability for these systems to recover within human timeframes. So I think the point about the level of harm we are willing to risk at this point, when we know so little about in terms of wider ramifications on other productive economies, if you like. From our point of view as a Pacific Civil Society Collective, we've drawn a hard blue line. We think that based on best available science, understanding the risk that's been taken, we don't think that deep sea mining has any role to play and should have any role to play at this kind of current point in time in history.
Okay, so I'm sorry, we're almost out of time, and I want Salim to be able to respond to that.
You see, the challenge is you keep saying 500 marine scientists. Note marine scientists, not system scientists, people who are looking at the whole planetary issue. There's become this parochialism around each ecosystem. These are well-intentioned, brilliant people, the 500 scientists, but they are not looking at this from a macro perspective. Unfortunately, we do not have any free lunch in the universe. We will end up having to make some trade-offs. We do that on a daily basis. So I think Daniel's point is very important. We have to first make sure if deep sea mining is to happen, there must be offsetting with reference to terrestrial mining, because the only cogent case to be made is that there needs to be some reduction on terrestrial mining. As someone who studied terrestrial mining for 20 years, the impacts are terrible. And in terms of social disruption, far worse than the sea. You have people dislocated physically, and that does not happen. One of the reasons some Pacific islands like Nauru are interested is because they've been ravaged by terrestrial mining. And they see this as an opportunity to have revenues. And
if I could just interject here.
Actually, very quickly.
Look, using Pacific Island states such as Nauru to justify and fast-track deep-sea mining is really, really inappropriate. I think it is almost like comparing apples to pears, comparing land-based mining and deep-sea mining. I think that the jury is really quite clear on impacts of deep-sea mining on the ocean floor. Ramifications will be beyond. You cannot remediate what you've destroyed. These are endemic species, cannot be found anywhere. We don't even know how much.
All right. Okay, Daniel, you're going to have the last word, and very quickly. I'm interested in a point that Salim made when he talked about, there's been a lot of talk about how car companies don't want to be involved. This is a business. Do they really leave themselves wiggle room that at some point they could jump on board with this if they want to?
Yeah, I mean, a commercial deep sea mining operation realistically isn't going to get started for a number of years at this point. It's hard to say whether it's 5 or 10. But, years down the line, if that becomes a viable source of cheap cobalt for car batteries, they could turn to that. But for the time being, and again, it's not all car companies, but
sure.
It is Volvo and BMW have made these commitments, at least in the short term, to avoid metals from the deep sea. But of course, those metals are not yet on the market anyway.
Okay, and that will be the final word. Daniel Ackerman, Salim Ali, Maureen Pinjueli, thank you for joining me for this conversation. We appreciate it very much. And we're going to pause the conversation right now, but a very big thank you, as I said, to our guests and to our YouTube community for joining us for this discussion. That is all for now. Take care. We'll see you later.